This is the Dungeon Master's Handbook. Welcome to episode 0 of the Dungeon Master's Handbook. I'm Michael, also known as Chicago Wiz, and welcome. Here we are. I never thought I would ever do anything like this, but I'm sitting in front of a microphone. We'll see how this works out. I will tell you right now, I am nervous as all hell, so if it shows, give me a couple of episodes and we'll see if it gets any better. Think of this as the pilot. This is kind of like the preface or introduction to your RPG books that you always skip over. So, but hopefully you'll listen to this and let me know what you think. So what is the Dungeon Master's Handbook going to be about? Well, I thought it would be interesting to share my love and how much I get into and my excitement and lessons learned over how to run Dungeons & Dragons campaign in an old school manner. And to that I mean open-ended type games, games that are player-driven, but also DM-guided and DM-ruled, if you will, with the DM making rulings, and generally a older feel to it. I hope to bring in some examples and lessons from running my own AD&D and OD&D campaigns. I've got a 9-year running AD&D campaign and roughly about 9 years OD&D campaign with my wife. You'll hear me talk about that a little bit. I also hope to bring out some things that inspire me, music or things that I've read on the web, books that I've read, and right now, this is solo. I'm hoping to possibly co-host this on a guest-by-guest basis. So if there's anyone you want to hear about or talk to in terms of running an old-school campaign, let me know. I would love to have people on and learn how they do their things and kind of compare and contrast and learn from each other. So, who am I? Why would you care about what I have to say? Good question. I think that maybe giving a little bit of history, I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since 1978. I walked into a cheap discount department store that's long since closed in Cincinnati, Ohio, and found this strange little box that had a dragon and a wizard and a fighter on it. And it was brightly colored and said Dungeons & Dragons on it. And looked at the back and it talked about having your own adventures and doing all sorts of neat things, and I bought it. And it's been true love ever since. That was the Holmes D&D Basic book. It came with little chits that you had to put into Dixie cups to get your random numbers. They didn't start putting in the dice until a couple of printings after the one that I got. But I found Advanced Dungeons & Dragons shortly thereafter. My first book actually was The Dungeon Master's Guide and not The Player's Handbook. And I was scared to read it because you open it up, it says, if you're going to play the game, don't go here. This is only for Dungeon Masters. And I thought, I don't want to do that. But being kind of a loner and a geek, couldn't really find anyone to play with, so I did look through the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then I bought the Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual, and found some really patient teachers at a local comic book / gaming store, and played my heart out till about the mid-'80s, and then I moved on. Battletech came out. There was the Star Trek combat simulation game, which then you could role-play Star Trek. About that time, somewhere around in there, Shadowrun came out. I fell into friends who were playing all sorts of different games and just really experimented around and then stopped playing for a while. So that brings us up to about 2008. Now, I hadn't played a role-playing game in probably, I want to say 10, 12 years. And I decided that I was going to hop back into Dungeons & Dragons. So I looked online and found that there was this new D&D version called 3.5. Well, I didn't know anything about that. So I got a hold of some used copies of the books and tried to put together a campaign. After trying to write a campaign and having to go to a spreadsheet to balance everything out and figure out how many experience points they were going to get from here and how was I going to do this there, it just felt all foreign to me. And I thought, I want to go back to what I know. So I discovered this thing called the OSR. Depending on who you talk to, that's either old school revolution, old school revival. Whatever it was right up my alley because these were people that were talking and actively playing in the older versions that I knew. So I jumped right into that. I started a blog, as it seems like everybody did in the late aughts, and had a lot of fun with that for a while. Took a pause from that, and then in 2015, restarted my campaigns back up and have been doing it and having fun ever since. I am partially responsible for the one-page dungeon template. Gentleman by the name of David Bowman and I were noodling around with how to make this thing work in late 2008, early 2009, and we put it out there on the internet, and in one of those things that happens, it kind of went viral. I was contacted later that year by a gentleman, Philippe Antoine Menard, who's also known as the Chatty DM. Hey, Chatty, how you doing? He had to talk me into running a one-page dungeon contest with him, and that took off, and that still runs every year. That was really a lot of fun, and it was neat to see the concept of the one-page dungeon template take off and become popular through mega dungeons like Stonehell. For those of you that have kept up with the OSR products, that's a very popular mega dungeon, and Mike Curtis was inspired by and tried to do that whole thing with the one-page dungeon, so seems to have worked out well. I also am really proud of my 9-year campaign. I started a campaign in 2009, went to a local game store here in Chicago called Games Plus, a really wonderful place. If you get a chance, I highly recommend it. They've been around for 40 years, and it really is a wonderful, warm store to go to. They made space available for me to be able to run a campaign, and started off with, I want to say there were 6 people at the first game. And in the life of the campaign, I think I've had close to 100 people play in my world, which is really kind of cool, both in tabletop fashion, either as a regular monthly game or at conventions. I always try to run a session in my campaign world. And I also have had an ongoing online campaign. Started off on an old technology called Google Wave, then went to Rizoma after Google Wave shut down. And it's been really neat to explore that world through a long period of time with a number of different players. And then along with the D&D campaigns, I decided to get the crazy idea, hey, let's run some war games in the same world. And I've been doing that now for the past few years, mainly at conventions, but once in a while I'll persuade some people to, hey, let's have a day of wargaming, and we'll come over and we'll do some war games in the world and see what happens. So that's a little bit about what I do. I've been really involved in the idea of running old school sandbox campaigns pretty much from the get-go. I've always been fascinated with the idea of putting a world together that players can explore and find new things and write their histories into it. And for me as a DM, it's kind of exciting because I can learn about my world through what they do. I get a sense of what interests them and what things they explore. And it's really neat to sit here at the table and listen to them talk about what they've discovered and what they think this means, and even find myself being influenced by some of those things. So I really get into that kind of an open-ended environment. I've never been one to really write plot-driven campaigns, or campaigns that have like a story where you go from point A to point B to point C. I know I don't like to play that way. Whenever I sit down with a video game, one of the first things I'm trying to do is to get off the rails. So I try not to do that to my players. I'd like to give them an environment where they have choices, and those choices matter. So that's a little bit about who I am and what I do. Getting back to this podcast, coming up in what I'm calling season 1, I'm not sure if we're going to have 12 or 16 episodes. We're going to kind of see how this goes. But the next few episodes are going to cover things like how to create a fun con game quickly. I just had to do that for Gamehole Con. I'm going to talk about how to start and run a sandbox campaign in an old school style. It always seems like whenever I blog about this or talk about this, there's a lot of interest in it, and so I thought I would share some of that in my podcast. I'm going to cover some of the lessons learned in running multiple games in your world. You put all this time and effort into a campaign world. Well, maybe you want to run 2 or 3 games in it, separate campaigns for separate groups. There's some interesting challenges there. I'd like to talk about how I've created my version of D&D. I call it AD&D Light. Although I play with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I've folded, spindled, and mutilated it into a shape that probably most people who play AD&D don't quite recognize, but it's still AD&D at the core. I'd like to cover a little bit about my solo game that I run with my wife, who I nicknamed the Princess Wife. We'll talk a little bit about wargaming in D&D, and maybe some of the tools that I've used to keep this 9-year campaign going. And I'd also like to do some interviews with some of my players, or other DMs who have similar interests. So, like to hear their thoughts and share them with you. So that's about it for episode 0. My idea of podcasts are kind of like TED Talks. I don't really want to go over 15, 20 minutes with them. So future broadcasts should be about this, or future episodes, I should say, it'll be about this short. So what do you think? You're listening to the Dungeon Master's Handbook. What would you like to know about running an old school campaign? What are your questions? What are your things that you run into, and how can I help? I certainly encourage you to drop me an email, drop a comment on wherever you've downloaded this podcast from. You can find me on the web at dungeonmastershandbook.wordpress.com, and let me know. So our next episode is going to be running a fun con game event, but doing it creating it in under 4 hours. That was the situation I found myself in, and I managed to have a very fun con game running it in old school style and managed to put it together with minimal prep. So we're going to talk about that. I want to thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my podcast either on iTunes or through SoundCloud through the RSS feed. You can also go to the website dungeonmastershandbook.wordpress.com and get notified when new episodes are up. So we'll see you next time.